This letter is impossible. My French is a disaster.
Je suis dans la dette.
No, Your Grace. That means you're physically inside a debt. You can speak.
I can't.
She was hired because she lacked a tongue or so, the housekeeper claimed. For 6 months, the Duke poured his family's darkest secrets into the silence of his parlor maid. Then came a tangled letter from Paris, a butchered translation, and the mute girl who finally spoke. The study of Ashbourne Manor always smelled of cold ash, damp wool, and impending ruin. Anthony sat behind a mahogany desk scarred by generations of careless men, staring at a ledger that refused to balance. His cuffs were frayed. There was an ink smudge on his thumb that he had been rubbing for 20 minutes, rawing the skin. He was 32, a duke by virtue of a dead father and a drowned older brother, and he was profoundly, exhaustingly tired. A sharp rap at the heavy oak door broke the silence. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, stepped in. She smelled aggressively of peppermint and starch. Behind her stood a girl. "The new parlor maid, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable announced. Anthony didn't look up. Does she gossip? The last one sold Charles's gambling debts to the Times, Chronicle Times, for £5. And, "No, Your Grace, she doesn't speak at all." That made Anthony pause. He raised his head. The girl was small, wrapped in a coarse gray dress that hung off her shoulders like a sack. Her hair was a dull, dusty brown, scraped back into a severe cap. She kept her chin pinned to her chest, staring intently at the frayed edge of the Persian rug. She didn't look frightened. She just looked incredibly still. "Deaf?" Anthony asked. "Mute," Mrs. Gable corrected, her voice lowering as if the girl were a skittish horse. "Childhood fever, they say. Her references are decent, though she comes from up north. Hard worker. And, as you requested, she cannot spread rumors at the butcher's shop." Anthony looked at the girl again. She smelled faintly of lye soap and the cold rain currently battering the window panes. Her hands were folded over her apron. "Fine," Anthony said. The word tasted like stale tea in his mouth. "Her name?" "Mary. Put her to work, Mrs. Gable. Start with the library. The dust in there is thick enough to choke a rat." Mary didn't curtsy. She gave a stiff, jerky nod and followed the housekeeper out. Anthony immediately forgot her. He went back to the ledger. If the wheat yield in the lower valley didn't improve by August, he would have to sell the London townhouse. He dragged his ink-stained thumb across his forehead, leaving a dark smear, and closed his eyes. Over the next few weeks, Mary became a fixture in the study. Anthony was a man who required isolation, but the estate demanded upkeep. The compromise was this silent, gray ghost who slipped in at dawn to lay the fire and returned in the afternoon to dust the sprawling bookshelves. She was exceptionally quiet. Anthony loathed the sharp clatter of coal being tossed into a grate, but Mary placed each lump with the precision of a mason. She didn't hum. She didn't sigh. She was an absolute void in the room, absorbing the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of Anthony's daily panic without adding to it. It started on a Tuesday in late November. The rain was turning to sleet, rattling against the glass like thrown gravel. Anthony was reading a letter from his brother's creditors. His stomach churned, a sour, acidic knot of pure stress. £4,000, Anthony muttered aloud, dropping the parchment onto the desk. He rubbed his temples. Where in God's name am I supposed to find £4,000 before Christmas? By the hearth, Mary was kneeling, sweeping ashes. She didn't break her rhythm. Scrape, sweep, scrape. Anthony leaned back in his leather chair, the springs groaning. I should sell the horses. Charles loved those damn horses. It would be poetic justice, but the stables are already mortgaged. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to the empty air, using her presence as a sounding board that couldn't judge him. It was pathetic. he knew. A duke bleeding his anxieties into the back of a crippled servant's head. But the pressure in his chest was so tight it felt like cracked ribs, and speaking the words uncoiled it, just a fraction. My father always said Charles was the golden boy, Anthony said, his voice dropping into a raspy, bitter register. Charles was the heir. Charles was the diplomat. I was just the spare who liked reading soil reports. And now Charles is rotting in a family vault, and I'm the one trying to pay off the whores and the bookmakers he left behind. By the fire, Mary stopped. It was a microscopic pause. The whisk broom hovered a millimeter above the stone hearth. Her spine stiffened. It lasted less than a second, and then she resumed sweeping. Anthony noticed it. A flicker of irritation crossed his mind. Did she understand the gravity of that? Did she care? No. She was a servant from the north. 4,000 pounds was a mythical concept to her. Yet, the habit formed. Winter dug its claws into Ashbourne Manor. The drafts grew sharper, carrying the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves into the house. And as the days grew shorter, Anthony found himself talking more. He talked about the leaky roof in the tenant cottages. He talked about his absolute disdain for London society, the powdered faces and the sharp, venomous smiles. He talked about the crushing, absolute loneliness of the title. "They look at me and see a ledger, Mary," he said one evening. The firelight threw long, flickering shadows across his face. She was polishing the brass handles of the cabinet, her back to him. The mothers with their debutante daughters. They see a title, a house, and a vault. They don't see a man. They see an institution. She wiped the brass. Squeak, squeak. "I could marry one of them," he continued, pouring himself a glass of cheap brandy. The good stuff was long gone. "A rich merchant's daughter. Sell my title for a dowry. To fix the roof. It's what men in my position do. Pimp out 1,000 years of history for a new copper roof." He took a drink. It burned his throat, raw and hot. Mary turned. She picked up her rags and her bucket. She kept her eyes on the floor, as always. But as she walked past his desk to reach the door, she paused. She didn't look at him. She just stood there for a heartbeat, the smell of beeswax and lye radiating off her. Then she reached out, pushed the bottle of brandy an inch further away from his glass, and walked out of the room. Anthony stared at the bottle. He didn't pour a second glass. 6 months. Spring broke over the estate not with warmth, but with a sudden, violent thaw. The snow melted into a thick, clinging mud that smelled of sour roots and worms. Anthony's boots were perpetually caked in it, much to Mrs. Gable's despair. Mary had changed, or perhaps Anthony's perception of her had shifted. She was no longer just a gray blur in his peripheral vision. He started noticing the contradictions. He noticed that while her hands were red from hot water, the calluses on her fingers were not on her palms from gripping a scrub brush, but on the sides of her index fingers, the mark of someone who held a pen or a needle for hours on end. He noticed the way she moved. She didn't shuffle like the kitchen girls. She walked with a strange, grounded balance. Her spine was always straight when she thought he wasn't looking. When he shifted his weight or sighed, she instantly collapsed her posture back into the deferential hunch of a terrified maid. It annoyed him. It made his skin prickle with an itch he couldn't scratch. He didn't want a mystery in his study. He wanted a mute servant. But his mind, starved for intellectual stimulation in the dreary countryside, couldn't help but pick at the threads. In April, a heavy leather-bound book slipped from his desk. It was Rousseau, printed in the original French. It hit the floor with a loud crack, sliding toward the hearth where Mary was stacking kindling. She flinched at the sound, looking down. The book rested open at her feet. Anthony watched her. He saw her eyes drop to the page. He saw the way her gaze tracked from left to right, scanning the first 2 sentences, the flicker of comprehension, the subtle tightening of her jaw. Then she blinked, her face going blank, and she picked up the book with clumsy, uncoordinated hands. holding it out to him upside down. Anthony took it. "Thank you," he said, keeping his voice flat. He watched her return to the fire. His chest felt tight. She read that. She read it, understood it, and then pretended she was illiterate. The realization didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a betrayal. Why lie? Why hide? What kind of parlor maid read French philosophy? He didn't confront her. He was a coward when it came to confrontation. He preferred the safety of his ledgers. By early May, the situation with Charles's debts reached a boiling point. The final, largest note was held by a Parisian banking syndicate, the Times, Société de Crédit de Paris. They had grown tired of Anthony's delayed payments and sent a final demand. Anthony had to write back. He had to negotiate an extension, offering the summer timber harvest as collateral. He had to do it in French because the syndicate director, a man named Mornet, explicitly refused to conduct business in English. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The study windows were open, letting in the smell of wet grass. Anthony sat at his desk, sweating through his shirt. His French was abhorrent. He had learned it from a half-deaf tutor when he was 12, and he hadn't used it since. He had a massive French-English dictionary cracked open on the desk. He was surrounded by crumpled balls of parchment. Mary was dusting the upper bookshelves, climbing a small wooden step stool. The rhythmic swish of her feather duster was the only sound in the room, aside from Anthony's heavy, frustrated breathing. "I am writing to entreat upon your patience," Anthony muttered in English, rubbing his eyes until he saw stars. He dipped his quill. He hovered over the fresh paper. He tried to force the words into French. "Je vous écris pour demander." He cursed under his breath. The grammar was a swamp. He sounded like an uneducated child. He scratched out the sentence. The nib of the quill snapped under the pressure, spraying a fine mist of black ink across his knuckles and the white paper. "Damn it to hell!" Anthony slammed his fist on the desk. Mary froze on the step stool. Anthony didn't care. He was drowning. The walls of the study felt like they were shrinking. If he couldn't write this letter, if he couldn't sound like a formidable, educated nobleman, Mornet would call in. The debt. Ashbourne would be liquidated. He grabbed a fresh quill. He didn't bother wiping the ink from his hand. He stared at the page. He needed to convey deference without weakness. He needed to say, "I am indebted to you, but I require time." He spoke aloud, testing the sounds, his accent thick and clumsy. "Je suis dans la dette de vous," he said, grinding his teeth. "Mais, je demande, le temps. Ho, ho." It was wrong. He knew it was wrong. It sounded crude. It sounded like a peasant begging for bread. It lacked the formal elegance required to placate a Parisian banker. "Je suis dans la dette," he repeated, squeezing his eyes shut. His chest heaved. A bead of sweat rolled down his neck. The shame of it, the sheer, degrading incompetence burned in his throat. "Je suis dans votre dette." That translates to a literal, physical presence inside a debt. "Your Grace," a voice said. Anthony's eyes snapped open. The voice was low. It possessed a strange, husky timbre, raw from disuse, scraping at the edges like sandpaper. But the accent was immaculate. The vowels were rounded, the consonants crisp. Anthony slowly turned his head. Mary was still standing on the step stool. Her hand, clutching the feather duster, was trembling violently. Her face was bloodless, pale as chalk. She looked terrified, staring at him, as if she had just watched someone die. The silence in the room rushed back in, deafening and heavy. Anthony didn't breathe. He looked at the girl in the coarse gray dress, the mute maid who smelled of lye and ash. "What did you say?" Anthony whispered. The words barely made it past his lips. Mary swallowed. He could see the frantic pulse beating in her throat. She gripped the edge of the bookshelf so hard, her knuckles turned white. She opened her mouth, closed it, and looked away, shrinking into her collar. "Mary," Anthony said. He stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. "Look at me." She didn't move. Anthony walked around the desk. His heart was hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. He stopped at the base of the stool. He was close enough to smell the starch in her apron. "Speak," he commanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of shock and sudden, inexplicable fury. "You have listened to me bleed my soul into this room for 6 months. Speak." Mary closed her eyes. A single, jagged breath shuddered through her chest. When she opened her eyes and looked down at him, the dull, terrified Maid was gone. The intelligence he had briefly seen when she dropped the Rousseau book was back, burning bright and sharp. "You are trying to convey formal obligation," she said, her voice steadier this time, the perfect, upper-class English accent slicing through the stuffy air of the study. "The phrase you are looking for is not times je suis dans la dette. It is fois je vous suis redevable." Anthony stared at her. His brain felt disconnected from his body. "And," she added, her voice dropping to a whisper, a strange mix of defiance and absolute defeat crossing her features. "If you use times demander le temps, Mornett will laugh you out of his office. You must use fois solliciter un delay." She stepped down from the stool. Her knees shook, but she kept her spine ramrod straight. She didn't look like a parlor maid anymore. Standing there in her ugly gray sack, with dust in her hair, she looked like a queen waiting for the guillotine. Anthony looked at the ink staining his hand. He looked at her. "Who in God's name are you?" he asked. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times. The sound dragged through the heavy silence of the study. Anthony's hand, still resting on the desk, was black with ink. It was drying, pulling at the skin of his knuckles. He stared at the girl in the gray dress. He felt a hot, humiliating flush creep up his neck. A sudden and violent wave of exposure. 6 months. For 6 months, he had treated her like a piece of furniture. He had paced this room, stripping away the polished veneer of his title to reveal the terrified, bankrupt man underneath. He had confessed his jealousy of a dead brother. He had spoken of selling himself to the highest dowry, and she had heard every single word, understood every single nuance. "There is goal." "Who are you?" Anthony repeated. The anger was rising now, a defensive shield against the naked vulnerability he felt. "And do not give me another lie. I will have Mrs. Gable drag the constable up here if I have to." The girl's jaw tightened. She didn't shrink back. The terror that had gripped her a moment ago was hardening into something brittle and defensive. "My name is Clara," she said. Her voice cracked on the second syllable. She cleared her throat, a harsh, scraping sound. "Clara Harrington." Anthony searched his memory. The name meant nothing to him. Harrington. And how does a Harrington end up scrubbing hearths in Somerset and pretending to lack a tongue? Clara looked at the ruined quill on his desk, then back to his face. "My father was a diplomat. He spent 10 years at the embassy in Paris. He was also a man who believed a lucky streak at the card tables would eventually pay for his lifestyle." She swallowed hard. The aristocratic cadence of her voice sounded grotesquely out of place, coming from a woman wearing a coarse linen cap and smelling of cheap lye soap. "He shot himself in a hotel room in Calais last October," Clara continued, her tone flattening out into a dead, emotionless rhythm. "He left me nothing but his debts. The men he owed money to did not care that I was a woman. They only cared that I was a Harrington. One of them, a man 3 times my age with a rotting jaw, offered to absorb the debt if I became his wife. The alternative was debtor's prison." Anthony felt the anger in his chest stutter and die, replaced by a cold, hollow sensation. "So you ran," he said. "I ran," Clara confirmed. "And I realized very quickly that a gentlewoman, traveling alone, is a target. A woman who speaks with an educated accent, who asks for directions, who negotiates for a carriage she leaves a trail. But a mute peasant girl? She is invisible. People talk over her. People ignore her. You look right through her." She looked directly into his eyes, her gaze uncompromising. As you did, Your Grace. Anthony flinched. The accusation landed square in his chest. You deceived this household. You invaded my privacy. I cleaned your floors. Clara snapped back, a flash of genuine temper breaking through her rigid control. Her chest heaved beneath the awful gray dress. I scrubbed the mud from your boots until my knuckles bled. I emptied your chamber pots. I did not ask to be your confessor. I wanted a warm corner and 3 meals a day where the men my father owed could not find me. I was perfectly content to let you talk to the walls. The silence returned, thick and charged with adrenaline. Anthony looked at her hands. They were raw. The skin cracked around the fingernails. He looked at the ink staining his own hand. They were 2 people drowning in different oceans, colliding in the dark. He turned away, pressing the heels of his hands into his eyes. His head throbbed. The syndicate, Mornet, the 4,000 pounds. The crisis hadn't evaporated just because his parlor maid was a runaway aristocrat. If anything, the clock was ticking faster. He dropped his hands and looked at the mangled parchment on his desk. Can you write it? He asked, his voice low, stripped of any commanding edge. Clara frowned, thrown by the sudden shift. What? The letter to Mornet, Anthony said. He picked up a fresh piece of paper and slid it across the mahogany. He placed a new quill beside it. You said my French was archaic. You lived in Paris. You know how these men think. Can you write it? Clara looked at the desk. She looked at Anthony. The distrust between them was a physical entity in the room, heavy and suffocating. But beneath it was a stark, ugly pragmatism. If Anthony lost Ashbourne, Clara lost her hiding place. She walked slowly toward the desk. She didn't go to the chair opposite him. She walked around to his side, stopping a foot away. The smell of peppermint starch and beeswax was stronger now. You cannot beg, Clara said, staring at the blank paper. Men like Mornet despise desperation. They smell it like blood. Then what do I do? Anthony asked. You threaten him, she said softly, politely, with immaculate grammar. Anthony pulled his chair back and gestured for her to sit. Clara hesitated, looking at the worn leather. Then, with a stiff, careful movement, she sat down. She picked up the quill. Her grip was awkward at first, her fingers stiff from months of holding scrub brushes. But as she dipped the nib into the inkwell, muscle memory took over. We will tell him, Clara murmured, her eyes narrowing at the paper, that the timber harvest is tied to a domestic naval contract. If he calls in the debt now, he triggers a legal dispute with the Crown over the lumber. It will tie his money up in chancery for a decade, but if he grants a 6-month delay, he gets his capital, with interest. Anthony stared at the side of her face. Is the timber tied to a naval contract? No, Clara said, the scratch of the quill filling the room. But Parisian bankers do not understand English property law. They only understand risk. We give him a risk he cannot tolerate. Anthony watched the ink flow. Her handwriting was sharp, elegant, and entirely ruthless. The wait took 3 weeks. Spring bled into early summer. The study grew stuffy, smelling of old leather and dried lavender. Clara remained merry to the rest of the house. She still wore the gray dress. She still kept her chin tucked to her chest when Mrs. Gable was in the room. But in the study, behind the heavy oak door, the silence had fractured. It wasn't a sudden, cinematic friendship. It was a slow, abrasive negotiation of boundaries. Anthony would read the agricultural reports aloud. Clara would point out his mathematical errors while polishing the brass. They rarely spoke of her father or his brother. Their conversations were strictly tactical, built on the mutual understanding of people living on borrowed time. Anthony noticed that Clara drank her tea black, hoarding the sugar lumps in her apron pocket, a habit born of starvation that she couldn't break. Clara noticed that Anthony only rubbed the ink smudge on his thumb when he was terrified of failure. On a suffocating Thursday afternoon, the mail arrived. Anthony was standing by the window, his coat discarded, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. The sky outside was a bruised purple, threatening a summer storm. Mrs. Gable entered, holding a silver tray. "From France, Your Grace," she said, her nose wrinkling slightly at the foreign stamps. Anthony took the heavy, cream-colored envelope, his pulse hammered in his throat. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable. That will be all." The housekeeper curtsied and left, closing the door with a solid click. By the fireplace, Clara stopped dusting. She stood perfectly still, the feather duster hanging limply from her hand. Anthony broke the wax seal. His fingers felt thick and clumsy. He unfolded the thick vellum. The handwriting was aggressive, sprawling across the page. He scanned the French, his eyes catching on the key phrases. Point sollicité, un délai. Complication juridique. Point accordé. Anthony let out a breath that he felt he had been holding for 6 months. He closed his eyes, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. "Well?" Clara asked. Her husky voice was tight, vibrating with tension. Anthony opened his eyes. He looked at the woman in the ridiculous gray cap. "He accepted," Anthony said. 6 months extension. The estate is safe through the winter." Clara exhaled. It was a ragged, ungraceful sound. She leaned back against the stone hearth, closing her eyes, her knuckles white as she gripped the mantle. Anthony walked over to the drinks cabinet. He didn't speak. He took out the bottle of cheap brandy. He poured 1 glass, the amber liquid splashing against the crystal. Then, he hesitated. He reached into the back of the cabinet, pulled out a second glass, and poured another measure. He walked across the Persian rug and held the glass out to her. Clara opened her eyes. She looked at the glass, then at his face. Her expression was guarded, full of the cynical caution of a woman who had learned that nothing in the world was free. "I cannot offer you a title," Anthony said quietly, the thunder rumbling low and heavy outside the window. "I cannot offer you London society, or ball gowns, or a life free of ledgers. I am essentially a glorified farmer drowning in a dead man's mistakes." He kept the glass suspended between them. "But," he continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly, grounded pitch, "I require a secretary, someone who understands French bankers and doesn't flinch at the sight of a negative balance. It pays a salary. It comes with a room in the East Wing, not the servants' quarters. And you would never have to touch a whisk broom again." Clara stared at him. The air in the study felt thick, charged with the approaching lightning. She didn't smile. It wasn't a fairy tale. She knew the reality of their situation. 2 ruined people, hiding in a crumbling manor. But as she looked at Anthony's ink-stained thumb, and the exhausted, honest relief in his eyes, the rigid set of her shoulders finally relaxed. She reached out. Her rough, calloused fingers brushed against his. The texture of her skin was imperfect, scarred by lie and hard labor, but her grip was steady. She took the glass. "I expect Sunday afternoons off, Your Grace," Clara said, raising the brandy to her lips. Anthony's mouth twitched into the first genuine smile he had worn in a year. "Negotiable, Miss Harrington. Highly negotiable." Outside, the storm broke, the rain hammering against the glass. But inside the study, the fire was lit, and, for the first time in his life, Anthony did not feel the cold. Did Anthony and Clara's cynical alliance leave you wanting more grounded, historical drama? If you loved this raw, realistic take on romance and survival, hit that like button and share the video with your fellow history buffs. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another story, where the quietest characters make the loudest impact. Drop a comment below. Would you have hidden your identity, like Clara did? Let's debate.